Today, I'm going to use my Boldin software. I'm going to share that in just a second to answer a question I often get asked. Hey, Joe, what rate assumptions do you use for rates of return in different asset classes? You may have a brokerage account, an IRA, Roth account, savings account, CDs, money market funds. What do you use inside of Boldin for pessimistic, average, and optimistic? What do you use for mortality and why? And also inflation. And Bolden allows you to have general inflation, Social Security inflation, housing inflation, and medical inflation all separated out. What do you do? How big of a deal is it to get those right? Well, first thing I'll say, it's a big deal to get those right. Assumptions mean everything inside your planning. So let's get right to it and start talking from examples. Again, you're going to see me look over here. I got two screens. Probably see me small in the corner right now. So this is the Boldin overview. Okay, and Boldin is a software that I love. My plan is in Boldin. These are not my numbers. Okay, this is a dummy account they gave me. I use it for demo like this. But yeah, it's an outstanding plan. I love it for taxes. If you don't have a good grasp of taxes, good vision of taxes through your mortality, especially at RMD time, check out Bolden. Free 2 weeks. I think it's the first link below. First link. Check them out. It's game changer. Will be your reaction. Game changer. Okay, so let's get into this. I'm not going to cover the whole package. I'm just going to go into the assumptions. So here we are on the accounts and assets that we have. So right here is my, and you can add many accounts here. This is just the three I used for this example. You know, the IRA, 401k. I said this person or this couple, they're 61 years old, by the way. 163. The spouse is 2 years older in this example. So $700,000, and you can link the account. There's a question I get a lot. But this person has an optimistic rate of return of 10% and a pessimistic of 5. The software automatically calculates the average of 7.5. Okay. And inside of Boldin, you could toggle between, very simply, this tab up here. You can go between optimistic. It does every optimistic assumption. We'll get into all those, for inflation and rates of return. Inflation and rates of return, average and pessimistic. It allows you to model if everything goes wrong, what's it look like? If everything goes right, what's that look like? So keep that in mind. So this 10, that's a big deal. That's a big deal. Problem I see with countless people is they've been earning, say, 10% for the last 40 years. And then when they go in retirement, they just want to be conservative and they put 6 in here. And then it says they need to work 1 more year or 2 more years or 3 more years because they put a number down here that's really conservative. Well, Boldin allows you to toggle between that with pessimistic. With pessimistic, we'll pick 5. Try to be accurate here. Another feature, and this is something Boldin's trying to improve, but another feature, this looks at 10%, the software behind the scenes looks at 10% rate of return and says, hey, this is probably an all stock portfolio. So we're going to use a standard deviation. Standard deviation is a measure of risk, and it's used as an input into Monte Carlo. It'll say this is an all stock. So we're going to use 15, 16%. If you put a lower number in here, like 5%, it's going to assume that you're in some kind of heavy bond fund, maybe like 20% bonds, 80%, or 20% equities, 80% bonds. And so it's going to use a standard deviation of like 5 or 6 or 7. So something much lower based on history that received that rate of return. Does that make sense? That's an input behind the scenes for calculating standard deviation. And standard deviation is a lot of what people use to judge the success of a plan. For example, if I come up here to overview, here's my Monte Carlo graph over here. This is the worst 10% line, and this is straight line projected at the 10%, for example, that I have it set on optimistic. So this person has an 88% probability of success. They use the target of 10% rate of return for that IRA and a standard deviation probably of 16 or 17. Okay, so it's a big deal to try to be accurate there on your accounts. So let's go back to accounts and assets. So we just looked at this IRA, the brokerage account, $100,000. I got set up exactly the same. I've got 10% optimistic if everything goes better than I think, pessimistic at 5. Okay, and then this is my cash account. Maybe it's high yield savings, CD. I got a much lower number in there. Optimistically get around 4, pessimistically around 2. So the software is going to say, hey, when we vary this and go into our 1,000 simulations with Monte Carlo, this is probably more of a fixed asset that Joe is investing in here. So again, very critical. You try to be realistic with these numbers. A common fallacy is people lower those numbers, makes them work 2 or 3 more years. Try to be realistic with these numbers. Okay, so let's jump down to profile and goals. This is my profile of, of this simulation, not really me. But it says this person is 61, spouse is 63. Click this down arrow and it says, hey, this person's got longevity is 85 and this longevity is 85. What should you put in there for longevity? 85 is a decent number. But if you do put in something like 90, 95, 100, I've even seen that, you got to make sure that inside of your expenses, I'm going to go to expenses because it's a big deal how this is linked. The way I do this is I have base living expenses. This person's or family is 4,200. Base electric bill, water bill, food, base expenses. Going out to eat a couple times, just normal living, but not doing anything crazy. Then I got a $300 unplanned, and then these go through lifetime. This would, if you put 95 as your mortality, that'll be adjusted up for inflation every year through lifetime. But go spending, that's, hey, we're going to retire at 63, 64. I want to spend extra money on some fun things. I got $1,000 a month in here, $12,000 a year, put in whatever you want. But that go spending only goes to 75 for me. So this is 14 more years for this couple, 14 more years. And then that gets cut in half with slow go spending at 500. A common error I see is people just lumping everything into living expenses. Hey, these are my expenses. And knowing that there's going to be go years, slow go years, they lump it all together and make this 4,200, make it 7,000, and they have to work 3, 4, 5 more years. So if you use a higher mortality, be real on how much you're going to spend. I'm telling you, my dad's 88 now. He lives on Social Security. He's not living on the same amount of money as when he retired. He was 59 when he retired. He had a lot of go years where they've traveled a lot, spent a lot of money, gave gifts to kids, donated a lot more money. Now that he's past 85, really just hunkering down and going off these living expenses. So big deal how living expenses are directly linked to the profile, especially this longevity. Hopefully that makes sense. This is a big deal. A lot of people, they put in a lot of conservatism in here, and if you put 95 in here or 100, and then you have your expenses high, you have your rates of return low, guess what? You're going to be stuck on the flywheel of one more year, because you're going to see, hey, I can't retire according to Boldin or my analysis. I can't retire for 7 more years. You'd be more realistic in there of how you're really going to spend money. Real rates of return. You may find you can retire 2, 3, 4, 5 years earlier than you thought was possible. That is very common for me to get that. in a comment. I get about 4 a day. I love those. Those are my favorite comments. And one of the primary motivations for me to make videos is those 4 people. Okay. Those 4, I love everybody in this audience, but those 4 people really get me going because I know I'm helping, I'm being a small part of changing some lives and opening some eyes. Okay, then the last section I wanted to cover is rate assumptions, inflation, and appreciation. Okay, general inflation. We'll blow this up with the caret. General inflation. General inflation. Okay, I have optimistic at 2%. Optimistic inflation is low inflation, so 2%. Pessimistic, I put as 5. Now you could put 6 in there, but 6% inflation every year for the next 30 years can blow up a lot of plans. Most people are going to be able to dial back and you know, instead of buying steak, buy pork, things like that. Instead of going out to eat, you know, 3 times a week, you go out twice a month. So I put in 5 there so it doesn't blow up, but you know, that's a big deal. Medical inflation, I put optimistic 3, pessimistic 6, got that a little higher. Social Security, here's a very common error. Optimistic, this is your Social Security payment. I have optimistic at 2% and pessimistic at 5. You may look at that and say, Joe, optimistic is my Social Security going up. So I want that at 5%, and pessimistic if I only get a 2% increase. But folks, these Social Security and general inflation, they run together. You're not going to have 2% general inflation and get a 5% Social Security bump. That's not going to happen. So make sure you put Social Security in here correctly. It should coincide with these numbers up here in general inflation. Okay, so 2 and 5, 2 and 5. Very common error. Don't make that mistake. And then the last one is housing appreciation. This is for your net worth statement. So how much do you expect your house to increase per year? You know, 5% is a little low. Let's just say, hey, optimistic. Let's put that in 8%. No problem. Done. No problem. So there you go. Those are the assumptions that are required inside of Boldin to make your plan work. And they are important. Study, learn. This is what I do. Stress test. When I say stress test, you may take general inflation. Hey, I'm going to take general inflation pessimistic. I'm going to make that 7%. And I'm going to see what happens to my plan at 7%. Let's go back up to the plan. 7% inflation. You know, that was 88. It's down to 64. Inflation's a big deal. I think everybody knows that now. Well, there you go. If you got any questions, let me see them in the comments. Get a good discussion going. If you use different numbers than I showed here, get this to, you know, tell us why. One of the other features of Boldin is they have a help tab. They have a help tab, a chat. So to get into that chat and say, help, ask them a question. I'm telling you, I always hear back. It's usually in a few hours if it's on days, but within 24 hours, you're going to answer to your question. So I love Boldin. It is my retirement plan. It's contained in here. Everything I got from taxes, from income to rates of return to inflation, it's all in this package, backed up by a team at Boldin that make sure all the formulas are correct. Okay. Make sure all the formulas are accurate. I love that versus my previously used Excel spreadsheets. Comments, questions? It's Joe out.